London, 1817. The city stirred beneath a veil of coal-thick fog, its carriages creaking along icy streets while lamplighters fought the dusk with trembling flames. Yet far from the capital's restless pulse, an altogether different drama unfolded, one destined to eclipse the political grudges and whispered scandals that simmered through drawing-rooms. For on the distant moors of Northumberland, where wind ruled like an ancient sovereign and winter clung mercilessly to the earth, the first threads of a quiet tragedy, and an unexpected salvation, were beginning to weave themselves around two lives long hardened by sorrow and pride. Henry Ashford, Duke of Rothmore, had left London weeks before, abandoning Parliament's suffocating debates in favor of solitude. Once a formidable voice in the Lords, admired for his unwavering logic and unshakable composure, he had retreated into silence following the death of his young wife earlier that year. The fever had stolen her away in mere days, leaving him with a hollow estate, a restless staff, and memories too sharp to touch. Since her passing, he had felt himself shrinking into a colder version of the man he once was, a figure of stone, dutiful yet emotionally unreachable. Rothmoor Hall reflected him perfectly, grand, austere, and dimmed by grief. Despite his withdrawal, the Duke had not abandoned responsibility. That evening he rode across his snow-laden lands to deliver blankets and provisions to several tenant families. It was practical work, far more grounded than Parliament's theatrics, and it kept his mind anchored in the present. His horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm through the quiet, the only sound in an otherwise breathless night. The sky hung low, promising more snow, and the world seemed poised between stillness and storm. It was on his return to the manor, with darkness falling swiftly around him, that a strange shape caught his eye near the edge of the forest, an uneven mound where the snow had been disturbed. He slowed his horse, brows knitting as he strained to make sense of the pale form merging with the whiteness. Something about it tugged at his instincts, dissolving his habitual detachment. He dismounted immediately, boots sinking into the powder as he approached. What he found was a young woman, curled unnaturally, her skin ghostly against the snow. She wore nothing but a thin nightgown, its hem frozen stiff, its fabric clinging desperately to her shivering frame. Her hair, dark as wet ink, fanned across the ground. For a terrible moment, he believed she was dead. Yet when he knelt beside her, his gloved hand brushed her cheek, and a faint warmth pulsed beneath the cold. Her lips parted slightly, a fragile breath escaping. The Duke exhaled a sharp breath of his own, a sound more emotional than he had allowed himself in months. Anyone else might have shouted for help or sent a servant to fetch aid. But he felt an inexplicable urgency, a pull that defied rational explanation. Without hesitation, he wrapped his cloak around her trembling body and lifted her into his arms. She was light, nearly weightless, as though winter had already begun claiming her. His horse, sensing the shift, stood perfectly still as he mounted with her held against his chest. As he rode toward the hall, her head rested against his shoulder, and he felt the faint stirring of life with each shallow breath she managed. Several questions battered his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? What cruelty had driven her into the snow dressed so little? But he could not dwell on any of them. Her survival was the only concern that mattered now, and the grim set of his jaw told any observer that he had made a silent vow on her behalf. At Rothmoor Hall, the household erupted into startled motion as the Duke carried the unconscious woman through its great doors. Servants whispered behind gloved hands, eyes wide with speculation, yet none dared voice their thoughts aloud. The Duke's grief had forged a solemn aura around him, one that discouraged idle chatter and demanded unyielding respect. He ordered the housekeeper to prepare the warmest chamber beside the library, where the fires burned brightest. He remained at the young woman's side while maids fetched heated stones and dry linens, issuing calm, precise instructions with surprising familiarity, as though some dormant instinct for care had awakened within him. Once she lay properly tended, wrapped in thick blankets and slowly thawing before the hearth, her features became more visible. She was not a girl but a woman in her late 20s, her face elegant in its symmetry, refined yet softened by vulnerability. Despite her pallor, there was a quiet dignity in the slope of her jaw, in the faint set of her brow, in the delicate curve of her fingers as they weakly stirred against the coverlet. She was no common wanderer lost in the snow. Everything about her, even in distress, spoke of upbringing, education, and a life shaped by rules few could fathom. The Duke studied her from the armchair beside the fire, elbows resting on his knees as fatigue mingled with a strange, growing unrest. He had not asked for any company, much less the unexpected arrival of a mysterious woman, yet something about her presence stirred a resonance he could not name. He was a man accustomed to identifying threats and motives, but in her he sensed only fear and exhaustion, no trace of deception. And still, there was something familiar in the faint line of her jaw, something that tugged at memory without revealing its shape. Hours passed, marked only by the crackle of flames and the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Eventually, her eyelids fluttered, and she opened her eyes with the dazed confusion of someone pulled suddenly from darkness. She blinked several times, trying to orient herself. The Duke rose immediately, but slowly enough not to startle her. "You are safe," he said, his voice low, composed, yet softened around the edges in a way he had not expected. "You were found outside. The cold might have taken you had I been moments later." Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound emerged. Fear flickered in her gaze, not wild panic, but a deep, internalized dread, the kind that suggested she had fled something she did not dare name. She sank back against the pillows, breath trembling. He poured a small cup of warm broth and set it gently into her hands. She grasped it carefully, as though uncertain whether she deserved the kindness. "Do you remember your name?" he asked. A pause lingered between them, long enough to reveal hesitation. Then she nodded faintly, but she offered nothing more. He did not press her. For reasons he could not quite articulate, he understood instinctively that questioning her too soon might shatter what little strength she had left. Her silence did not carry deceit, it carried fear of the world outside these walls. "You may rest," he murmured. "No harm will reach you here." Her expression shifted, something like disbelief, quickly smothered by exhaustion. She allowed her eyes to close, surrendering at last to sleep. The Duke resumed his seat beside the fire, hands clasped, gaze steady upon her. He felt an unfamiliar sensation stirring within him, a subtle echo of something he had long buried, a sense that this moment, inexplicable as it was, had arrived with purpose. He knew nothing of her past, but he could see the weight of it pressing heavily though she lay silent. Whoever she was, whatever darkness had driven her into the snow, it was not finished with her. As the flames burned low and moonlight filtered through frost-laced windows, the Duke allowed a single thought to surface, clear and unsettling in its certainty. This woman, fragile yet noble in her suffering, would alter the stillness of his grief-bound world. And though he did not yet understand how or why, he sensed that bringing her in from the snow had set in motion a story neither of them could escape. And somewhere, just beyond the moors, the consequences of her flight were already stirring. The first morning that Lady Evelina Hawthorne opened her eyes in Rothmoor Hall, the world around her glowed with an unfamiliar gentleness. Firelight flickered across the chamber, casting honeyed warmth along the stone walls and softening the austere grandeur that might otherwise have overwhelmed her. For a moment she lay still, suspended between gratitude and dread, attempting to decipher whether this sanctuary was truly safety or merely a pause before her past reclaimed its hold. Her breath formed a faint tremor in the air as she listened to the muffled sounds of servants beginning their day, each movement beyond the door reminding her that she was an intruder in a household that did not yet know what her presence might cost. The Duke of Rothmore entered quietly, his steps disciplined yet unforced. He greeted her with a measured inclination of his head, as though mindful that too much formality might intimidate her while too little might breach propriety. She noticed, even through her exhaustion, how his grief lived just beneath the surface of his courtesy. There was a restrained softness in his expression, a man accustomed to projecting calm despite the ache that lingered behind his eyes. It was the kind of composure forged through heartbreak rather than arrogance. "I trust you rested," he said, his voice low but reassuring. Evelina managed a faint nod. "You have been exceedingly kind, Your Grace. I owe you more than I can express." "You owe me nothing," he replied, and though his tone was polite, something in his manner suggested he meant it with surprising conviction. "Should you feel strong enough, breakfast will be brought to you. There is no rush." His thoughtfulness sent a flicker of warmth through her, but fear remained intertwined with every breath she took. She had fled her father's household under cover of night, knowing that discovery would mean confinement in a sanatorium, a fate reserved for troublesome women whose voices proved inconvenient. She had spoken the truth about her father's misdeeds, and the truth had offered no shelter. Now, here she was, nestled in the home of a man whom Lord Hawthorne despised, though the Duke did not yet know her name. When he withdrew from the chamber, she surveyed the items arranged around her bed with careful attention. A thick woolen shawl lay folded atop a chair, its stitching so fine it could only have belonged to someone who once valued beauty. Evelina touched it delicately, recognizing the faded scent of rosewater woven into its fibers. It felt like a borrowed memory, tender and intimate, though clearly intended only as comfort. Beyond it waited a stack of books, their leather spines gleaming softly in the fire's glow. Titles on philosophy, history, and poetry hinted at a mind cultivated beyond mere nobility. These were not tokens of indifference, they were gestures of dignity. Later that afternoon, having regained enough strength to sit upright, she was escorted to a small drawing room overlooking the frozen gardens. A silver tray held a simple meal, tea, soft bread, and broth, while the frost-laced windows framed the pale winter sun. It was a tranquil setting, deliberately chosen to spare her from scrutiny. The Duke's household was efficient and loyal, but servants had an instinctive talent for stitching rumors into tapestries of speculation. Already she sensed the undercurrent of curious glances trailing her movements, though none dared voice questions in the Duke's presence. When the Duke of Rothmore returned that afternoon, Evelina found herself studying him with greater clarity. His stature was imposing without being harsh, his features carved with a symmetry that might have been intimidating were it not softened by a certain weariness. He carried himself like a man who bore more than his share of responsibilities, one whose grief had not diminished his sense of duty. He seated himself across from her, maintaining the polite distance expected of a gentleman. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled between them, breathing warmth into the silence. It was he who finally broke it. "There is no need for alarm," he said with a calm steadiness that eased her trembling pulse. "You are under my protection for as long as you require it. Should you wish to remain unnamed, I will not press you." His generosity pressed against the fragile defenses she carried. "I do not mean to impose. Truly, I had nowhere to go." He regarded her carefully, as though assessing not her words but the weight they carried. "Then allow this to be a beginning rather than an end." The statement was simple, yet its sincerity unsettled her. Not because she distrusted him, but because kindness, in her experience, often carried hidden costs. Still, his words planted a quiet seed of hope she dared not fully acknowledge. Days passed, each one casting her deeper into the rhythms of Rothmoor Hall. Her health returned gradually, her mind sharpening once more. She discovered that the Duke's private library held more books than some academies she had known, each organized not for display but for use. When the Duke noticed her interest, he offered her unrestricted access. She spent hours immersed in texts she had longed to read, each page a reminder that her intellect, so often condemned as unfeminine by her father, was not a flaw but a gift. In return, she offered small acts of gratitude. When she noticed stacked letters awaiting response on the Duke's writing table, she timidly proposed assistance. He hesitated at first, then allowed her to read through several tenant petitions. Her clear, precise summaries surprised him, revealing not only intelligence but compassion for the families who depended upon him. "You see what others overlook," he remarked one evening as the lantern's glow played across his face. "You read between the lines with unusual acuity." She felt heat rise to her cheeks, though his tone held no flirtation, only respect. "I have learned that what is written often hides more than it reveals." Spoken like someone who has encountered duplicity far too often, he murmured, almost to himself. Their rapport deepened, woven from shared silences and unspoken recognition. Yet the fragile equilibrium of their growing connection soon threatened to tip. One morning, while the Duke was away inspecting tenant cottages, a liveried messenger arrived bearing a sealed letter addressed to His Grace. The wax bore a serpent coiled around a hawthorn branch, a crest Evelina knew all too well. Her breath caught painfully, a cold dread washing through her. Her father's reach had begun to extend outward in search of her. The world she had fled was stirring. When the Duke returned, he accepted the letter with his usual composure. Yet Evelina noticed the slight tension in his jaw as he turned the seal between his fingers. She excused herself with practiced politeness, retreating to the quiet of her chamber. There, she retrieved the small silver locket she had hidden beneath her pillow, the single possession she carried from her old life. Inside lay the crest of the Hawthorne family, proof of everything she hoped to escape. Later that night, as she slept fitfully, the Duke entered to check on her, moved by concern he no longer attempted to conceal. His gaze fell upon the locket gleaming faintly beside her hand. Recognition struck him with chilling clarity. He knew the crest. He knew its implications. He drew in a slow, controlled breath, steadying himself as the truth settled over him. The woman he had rescued, protected, and come to trust was the daughter of the one man he had sworn never to forgive. He turned toward the fire, its embers glowing like watchful eyes. The revelation pressed heavily upon him, yet he did not wake her. Her breathing remained soft, unaware of the storm gathering around her name. And as the hall settled into deep winter silence, the Duke understood that the quiet sanctuary he had offered her was now balanced precariously between mercy and conflict, its future shadowed by a feud neither had chosen yet both would soon be forced to confront. The discovery of Evelina's locket altered the atmosphere of Rothmoor Hall with a subtle yet undeniable tension. Though she remained unaware of what he had learned, the Duke of Rothmore carried the knowledge with a heavy, measured silence. In the calm hours before dawn, as snow pressed like a muted veil against the windows, he lingered beside the hearth in her chamber, studying the small emblem engraved into the silver. The crest he knew too well. Its serpent and branch were stitched into years of political hostility, whispered accusations, and a rivalry that had once cost him dearly. Now the daughter of that house slept under his roof, sheltered by the very man her father had worked tirelessly to discredit. By morning, the Duke's composure had settled into something colder. Not cruel, but guarded. He withdrew into himself, dividing his attention between estate obligations and an internal conflict he could not yet resolve. Evelina sensed the shift almost immediately. The warmth he had shown her in recent days, those gentle exchanges over books, the thoughtful quietude they had shared, seemed to recede behind a newly drawn wall. His politeness remained impeccable, yet there was a distance in his gaze that had not been there before. Her heart clenched with unease, for she had grown accustomed to the steadiness of his presence, the certainty that he offered a sanctuary not merely of walls but of spirit. She had known from the moment she stepped into his home that she could not remain hidden forever, yet she had hoped for time to regain her strength, to steady her voice, to prepare her truth. Now she feared that truth had already reached him in its most unforgiving form. That evening, unable to endure the strained quiet between them, she sought him out in the library. The room's heavy curtains and towering shelves lent an air of solemnity, softened only by the amber glow of lanterns. The Duke stood near the window, the faint outline of snow drifting behind him. His posture was rigid, hands clasped behind his back, a stance Evelina recognized as one of internal dispute. "Your Grace," she began gently, "I fear I may have given offense, though I cannot guess how." He turned, his expression carefully composed. "You have given none. The responsibility for this distance lies with me." His voice was even, but she heard the strain beneath it, a subtle crack in his otherwise unshakable reserve. She stepped closer, though not so near as to presume upon his space. "If I have become a burden, you have only to say so. I may not yet be fully myself, but I can depart if it would restore your peace." He inhaled sharply, not with irritation, but with something akin to sorrow. "Peace is not what eludes me, Lady Evelina." For the first time since their initial conversation, he used her name fully. The sound settled over her with a gravity that sent a chill down her spine. "You know," she whispered. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes." She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. "I had hoped to tell you when I had gathered the courage. But I understand if the revelation has changed your view of me." He moved toward the desk, resting one hand upon its edge. "It has changed nothing of your character," he said quietly. "But it alters much of what surrounds you." Evelina folded her hands before her, fingers trembling. "My father's sins are not mine, though I have suffered under them. He would rather see me locked away than allow truth to threaten his standing." The Duke studied her face with a mixture of empathy and restraint, as though battling his instinct to console her. "Tell me what drove you into the snow," he said. "Not as an interrogation, but because I must understand." She nodded, gathering her breath. "My father has long feared exposure for actions he cloaks beneath the guise of political ambition. I discovered discrepancies in financial ledgers, payments disguised as charitable donations. When I confronted him, he accused me of hysteria. He planned to confine me under the pretext of treatment, a common fate for women who proved inconvenient. I had little choice but to escape." Her voice did not waver, though pain threaded through each word. "I left with nothing but the nightgown I wore, convinced that freezing upon the road was preferable to losing my mind in a locked room." The silence that followed wrapped around them like dense fog. The Duke lowered his gaze briefly, as though wading through the memory of his own losses. His wife's illness, the helplessness that had swallowed him then. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of both judgment and understanding. "What your father sought to do is unconscionable," he said. "Whatever conflict existed between him and me does not diminish the cruelty he inflicted upon you. But it binds me to his name," she replied softly, "and to the feud you shared." He approached her then, not hesitantly, but with solemn purpose. The faint scent of firelight clung to his coat, and when he stopped before her, his presence dispelled a fraction of her fear. "You are not responsible for the shadows cast by another," he said, "and I would not see you punished for speaking the truth." Emotion tightened her throat. "Yet I draw danger to you simply by existing here." He met her gaze without flinching. "Perhaps. But I do not regret finding you. Nor do I regret offering you shelter." Her breath caught in her chest. "Even knowing who I am?" "Especially knowing," he replied, his voice low. "For it means you have endured far more than I guessed." The admission sent warmth spiraling through her, fragile yet undeniable. She sensed a fracture in his restraint, a shift that drew them inward rather than apart. Still, uncertainty lingered, an unspoken awareness that the world beyond the hall remained hostile and eager for scandal. "I cannot ask you to keep me here," she murmured. "Not when whispers threaten your reputation." He shook his head slowly. "Reputation is not my greatest concern. Your safety is." The firelight flickered between them, casting dancing shadows along the shelves. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space they occupied, the quiet exchange of understanding that bridged 2 lifetimes of wounds. The Duke exhaled softly, as though surrendering to a decision that had been forming long before he admitted it aloud. "You are not a burden, nor an obligation," he said. "You are a woman who deserves the right to choose her future, not one decided by fear." Her eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears away with dignity. "I do not know how to thank you." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Then do not. Simply allow yourself to remain, until you no longer tremble at the thought of what comes next." Evelina looked at him, searching for any hint of insincerity, and found none. What she saw instead was a man wrestling with his own vulnerability, offering trust despite the risks it carried. A warmth blossomed in her chest, quiet but resolute. She inclined her head, accepting the fragile promise between them. "Then I shall stay," she said. The words settled in the room with a sense of inevitability, a choice that drew them closer, binding them not through duty but through shared resilience. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried, as though the night itself approved. In the days that followed Evelina's confession, Rothmoor Hall seemed to inhale a deeper stillness, as though its ancient stones sensed the delicate balance taking shape within its walls. The Duke of Rothmore moved through the estate with renewed purpose, no longer driven solely by duty but by an emerging resolve to shield the woman whose presence had reawakened a long-dormant part of his heart. Evelina, though still wary of the world beyond the moors, began to reclaim fragments of herself, fragments she once believed forever silenced under her father's authority. Yet they both understood that sanctuary could not last indefinitely. The outside world had begun to stir, and whispers always found their way into places where peace resided too deeply. One morning, a letter arrived from London bearing the seal of a political ally of the Duke, its tone urgent and apologetic. Word had spread. Lord Hawthorne was searching for his daughter with increasing desperation, though he masked his motives behind claims of paternal concern. Newspapers hinted at scandal, speculating why the Duke sheltered an unnamed woman, and whether it signaled impropriety or political maneuvering. The implications were unmistakable. Silence would no longer protect Evelina. Action, if it came, would need to be deliberate and bold. When the Duke entered the conservatory where Evelina was tending to a few winter roses, his expression carried both gravity and tenderness. She looked up, sensing the shift instantly. "More news," she murmured, not as a question but a recognition. "Yes," he replied, stopping beside her. "Your father seeks to reclaim you, and society seeks to decide what this house conceals." Her hands trembled around the fragile stem of a rosebud. "I feared this. I feared the moment the world would demand its version of the truth." He reached out, not abruptly, but with careful intention, and took the pruning shears from her unsteady fingers. "You have lived too long under the burden of others' expectations," he said gently. "I will not allow their voices to dictate your fate here." She stepped back slightly, searching his face. "You cannot stand against them alone. Your reputation, your standing in Parliament." He shook his head. "What remains of my reputation is hardly the compass it once was. Since my wife's passing, I have discovered that honor without conviction is but a hollow crown." His gaze softened, steady and unwavering. "Tell me, Evelina, do you wish to return to your father?" Her breath left her in a quiet rush. "No. I wish only to live without fear, to speak without being silenced. But I do not wish to be the cause of your downfall." "You are not," he said firmly. "You are the cause of my clarity." The admission settled between them with delicate intensity. Evelina felt the weight of her solitude lift slightly, replaced by something steadier, something she had not dared to hope for. Before she could respond, the Duke continued, his voice low but resolute. "If we are to face what comes, it must be with truth, not rumor, not concealment. I will speak publicly of your presence here, as a guest under my protection, as a woman wronged, not disgraced." Her eyes widened. "They will twist your intentions." "They may try," he said, "but I will not yield." True to his word, the Duke traveled to London the next day, presenting himself at a winter gathering attended by key members of Parliament. His appearance alone drew whispers, yet when he spoke, calmly acknowledging that a young noblewoman resided at Rothmoor Hall under his guardianship, he allowed no room for insinuation. He offered neither apology nor embellishment, only clarity. It was an audacious gesture for a man so recently cloaked in mourning, and the room absorbed his declaration with a mix of admiration and unease. Lord Hawthorne confronted him afterward, his voice sharp with outrage thinly veiled as concern. Their exchange unfolded with icy restraint. The Duke laid out the truth, or as much of it as propriety allowed. Evelina had fled because she feared for her well-being, and she would not be forced back into a household where her safety was uncertain. Hawthorne blustered, threatened political consequences, hinted at scandal, but the Duke remained unmovable. When cornered, Hawthorne retreated into silence, knowing that public exposure of his actions would bring him far more ruin than any perceived defiance from his daughter. By the time the Duke returned to Rothmore, a fragile peace had been brokered. The world would continue whispering for a while, but the sharpest threat had been disarmed. Evelina met him in the great entrance hall, her expression tight with anticipation. "It is done," he said quietly. Relief washed over her, though uncertainty lingered in her gaze. "And what of us?" she asked, barely daring to speak the question. He stepped toward her, each movement deliberate, as though crossing an invisible threshold. "Evelina," he said, his voice deepening with unguarded sincerity, "in all the months since my heart was rendered barren, nothing has stirred it back to life but you. Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude, but because you stand before me with courage forged through suffering and grace untouched by bitterness." He paused, searching her eyes. "Stay, not merely as my guest, but as the woman with whom I wish to rebuild what I thought forever lost." Tears glimmered in her eyes, though they did not fall. "I feared I would bring only shadows into your home." "You brought light," he replied simply. She breathed his name then, softly, reverently, and it was answer enough. Winter sunlight filtered through the high windows, illuminating them in pale gold. The future remained uncertain, yet it was theirs to shape, no longer dictated by fear or feud but by choice. When spring arrived, the conservatory bloomed with roses once more, and Rothmoor's chapel opened its doors for a quiet ceremony attended only by those who wished them happiness. As Evelina stepped into the soft procession of blossoms and candlelight, she felt the final tether to her past loosen. The Duke reached for her hand with a steadiness that promised more than protection. He offered partnership, respect, and a love born not from circumstance but from the profound recognition of two wounded souls choosing one another freely. And so, beneath the gentle rise of spring birdsong, they began a new chapter, one shaped not by rivalry or fear, but by the enduring strength of truth and affection, an ending that felt less like a conclusion than the rightful beginning of their shared life.